Hello, my name is Anna Pollack. I am an associate professor and epidemiologist at George Mason University. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of vulnerable work. Here are the learning objectives for today. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the key points that you can take away from today's talk. So who are vulnerable workers? Vulnerable workers are women and children, immigrants, individuals with disabilities, Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latino racial and ethnic groups, as well as temporary workers. Why are these populations considered vulnerable? We'll start with children. Children have fewer legal protections that safeguard them in work situations. In addition, children are more likely to enter into informal work agreements. One study noted that 15% of children who work reported working off the clock, meaning that they worked hours for which they were not compensated. Disabled individuals are also considered a vulnerable worker group. This includes individuals with both physical and developmental disabilities. Workers with such disabilities are more likely to experience hazards at work, which can compromise their health, than those without such disabilities. Next, we'll turn to reasons why immigrants are considered vulnerable. Many immigrant groups also have fewer legal protections. They may also experience language barriers, which can complicate their understanding of their legal protections that they do have. They may also enter into informal work agreements. Immigrants are also more likely to enter into temporary work arrangements and are more likely to work multiple jobs, which can increase the chance of dangerous work environments. Black individuals and other people of color can face legal and non-legal discrimination throughout history. This includes their exclusion from the agricultural and domestic work from the Social Security Act in 1935 and the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. Next, we'll turn to several policies and regulations that pertain to vulnerable work. The first of these is the Fair Labor Standards Act. This act was codified in 1938, and it established standards for wages and overtime pay. The Fair Labor Standards Act restricts hours that children who are younger than 16 years of age are permitted to work. Agricultural workers, however, are exempt from this overtime pay requirement. So despite these protections, there are still certain worker groups that fall outside of the Fair Labor Standards Act protections. The Occupational Safety and Health Act was codified in 1970. In it, employees must be provided with a work environment that is, quote, free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. An additional key policy that pertains to vulnerable work is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Civil Rights Act ended Jim Crow-era segregation and the era of separate but equal under Plessy v. Ferguson. The Civil Rights Act stated that it shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employment agency to fail or refuse to refer for employment or otherwise to discriminate against any individual because of his race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, or to classify or refer for employment any individual on the basis of his race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Next, we'll turn to what are some characteristics of vulnerable work. This would include work that lacks formal work arrangements. There may be structural gaps for worker safety, as well as language barriers. There may be regulatory gaps for materials and goods and safety. temporary work is also included under the umbrella of vulnerable work. Next, we're going to turn to some key events in occupational history which contributed to bringing about additional worker safety measures. These are particularly salient for vulnerable worker groups. The first is the Monongah mining disaster. This disaster took place in December of 1907 in West Virginia. There was an explosion that occurred for unknown reasons in 2 different mines, and this resulted in the deaths of 362 individuals. Most of these individuals were immigrants. This was the largest mining disaster in U.S. history. Next, we'll turn to the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster. This occurred in the construction of a hydroelectric dam project. This project was occurring in Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, between 1930 until 1935. During the construction of this tunnel to bring hydroelectric power, 3,000 men used dynamite to construct this tunnel. However, no masks or protective equipment was provided, and occupational silicosis occurred in 474 of those workers, a very high rate. Next, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire occurred March 25, 1911 in New York City. In this tragedy, a fire occurred on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Triangle Waist Company garment factory. However, doors were locked in order to keep workers working and not allow them to take breaks. And there was only one fire escape available, which collapsed while people fled from the fire. 146 garment workers died. Most of these workers were young, female, and immigrants to this country. Although additional protections have been put in place since such events as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, this has not completely prevented these tragedies from occurring since. In 1991, there was a fire at a chicken processing plant in Hamlet, North Carolina. 25 individuals died due to smoke inhalation in that fire, and 54 individuals were injured. In 11 years of operation, this processing plant had never been inspected. Lessons learned from this fire included adding additional safety inspectors, creating more fire safety precautions, and improving the ability for workers to raise safety concerns without the fear of retribution. Of note, there have been some challenges to improving health for vulnerable workers. These include adding policies to safeguard workplaces, improving the assessment of exposure and dose, accurately understanding the interplay between workplace and other social and environmental factors, developing a more nuanced understanding of latency periods, and understanding individual variability and susceptibility to health conditions. Thank you for listening to today's talk about the history of vulnerable work.